Hugh Grundy and Chris White, the original Zombies. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So it was the fourth time was the charm, right? It was 4 nominations.
Is this working? Yeah. 4 nominations in 5 years. You know, and I have to say, I know that the fan vote is only in the end one of about 800 to 1,000 votes, but people take notice of it, and they really do. And I think the public perception of a really good and relentless amount of fan voting is hugely important. It doesn't guarantee things. You know, it's been good every time, but I really feel that some of the guys that we're seeing year after year on these cruises, they started to really, it's in the last 5 years that we've had 4 nominations, even though we've been eligible since 1986. And I really think that people like you guys have built such a fantastic relationship and fan base for us. And it means that when all the other artists that have previously been inducted and all the heavyweights in the industry, before they make their vote, they do check in on the fan vote, and it is important. And I know that it took us 4 nominations to get in, and I must say we did get to the point where we were thinking, well, it's just a real honour to be nominated. We honestly did feel that, but we thought, in the end, can't imagine getting past the winning post. And then we had that phone call saying that we were in, and so thank you again to all you guys. It's very important.
How was it? How did each of you find out? Was it a manager called, and did you then all call each other, or were you all together when you got the phone call?
I was actually, I live in Spain myself, and I was in my local place to have a drink, if you know what I mean, with my dear wife who's out there somewhere, bless her heart, and got a phone call to Tracy, my wife, and she said, hang on, it's New York, it's New York. She said, I've got to make you put your phone on and answer the phone when it rings, and she didn't say why. So the phone rang and I answered it, and it was our dear lovely Cindy, and she said, you've been nominated but don't tell anybody. Well, that was it. Fell apart completely.
Oh, so you didn't get to buy drinks for everybody in the bar to celebrate, is what you're saying?
No, it was empty.
I think you need to go back there after the ceremony.
It was 11 in the morning.
Get around for everybody.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
And Colin, for you, how did you hear the news?
Yeah, I was at home and I got a phone call, and it was incredibly exciting. It's only me and my family there, but incredibly exciting. Of course, then I got on the phone to everyone else and we're comparing notes. And like Rod, I'd got to the point where I thought, after all these nominations, possibly we would never be inducted. And you know, it was a big thrill for us to be nominated, to be absolutely honest. But when we were inducted, it was beyond belief. When you think that this band originally finished in 1967, and here we are being inducted in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, it's a phenomenon, and it's incredibly exciting, and it's a great honour. And if I could just second what Rod said, we owe so much to you fans for voting for us, and you have to be so tenacious, because it's over a whole month you have to keep voting. It's exhausting, I know it's exhausting. But thank you so much, it's such a thrill for us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Chris, for you, what's it like being, put back in the spotlight now and actually having to get ready for a trip to Brooklyn, New York, and get a tux and write a speech and everything? Are you well prepared for
You
this?
don't have to write a speech.
Well, if you want to.
No, it's just like it's just like 50 years have passed, and we're still all friends. That's the strange thing for a 60s band. We still like each other, and we still talk to each other and work. So it is fantastic for me. And of course, the magical thing is the day we will be inducted.
time of the season reached #1 50 years ago.
That's incredible. And of course, with Heavy Heart, that Paul won't be there, but I'm no doubt he'll be there in spirit that night.
He will be.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And his wife Helen will be there. But yeah, I mean, we always think about Paul. When we did the Odyssey and Oracle 50th anniversary, we decided just for a year we would concentrate on that album. We went all over America with the 4 original guys and with our fantastic current band that we still love playing with all the time. And each night, at the end of the time of the season, a picture of Paul came up on the back of the screen, and we did dedicate, you know, the whole thing that year. We were very aware of Paul and his contribution and everything.
Right, exactly. Well, it's going to be a wonderful night. I don't think the embargo's been lifted yet, but you do know who is inducting you, right? I understand.
We do, yeah.
You do know, okay. Now, not only was there great fan support, but the industry as a whole really rallied around you guys. Colin, I remember when you and I spoke the day that the nomination was made, the news of your independent nomination was made public. You know, you mentioned quite a lot of people who have been behind you, and one in particular who you a bit said is no longer here to celebrate with you that night.
Well, absolutely. I mean, Tom Petty has been such a supporter of the band for a long, long time. And in fact, if I remember correctly, the first rock and roll concert he ever saw was a show that we were involved
In Jacksonville.
Yes, and he was very taken with the whole thing, and he was describing Chris's bass. It had a tiger's tail on the end.
Still got it.
Not a real tiger's tail. It had a tiger's tail on the end of it. He remembered that first time that he saw rock and roll, and we were, I think there were 10 or 12 acts on the bill, but he remembered us specifically, and he's supported us so incredibly over the last 15 or 20 years, and of course it's a tragedy that he's gone anyway, but for us it's even a double tragedy, because it would have been lovely if he'd been involved in our induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
And we were so pleased that in the last year before he died, we actually got to know him quite well. We spent some time at his house and did some recording on his he broadcast from his studio. And he came along to a couple of our concerts and everything. And you know, it was such a tragedy that he died, but I'm so pleased that we did get to know him personally a little bit before he actually went.
And again, we cannot say who will be inducting you, and even for some of you people who think that I know everything about rock and classic rock, I don't know who's inducting them, but let me just ask this. Are you pleased with the selection? Because sometimes the Rock Hall picks somebody just for popularity purposes and doesn't always gel well with the artist who's being inducted. Are you guys pleased with the decision?
Absolutely. Absolutely, yes. They're a fabulous artist, and also they have a very strong connection with the band, which I think is really important. So we're thrilled, we're absolutely thrilled.
All right, well, we look forward to who that will be. You get to perform that night? Have they given you the marching orders on which 3 songs we'll be playing and stuff?
Yeah, I don't know if we're allowed to actually... No, we can't.
No, we
can't
say.
Okay, all right.
But
we're going to be doing, actually, we're going to be doing Please Please Me, Hard Day's Night.
I think you'll know them. I think you'll know what we're going to play.
Well,
Love you do.
It's March 29th in Brooklyn, New York, so it'll be fun to welcome you to my hometown. Matter of fact, 1965, you played there, Murray the K's Christmas show. 64 was it? So I was all of two years old, so I didn't make it to the show. I apologize, but there was something in the air, and it made its way down to my section of town, and I knew someday I would be sharing a stage with you guys. But 7 performances a day. Is that true for that Murray the K show?
Well, it was, but
I mean, it's not a full concert. I get that.
No. The shows were very different. It was just the tradition then, where you would have 15 or 16 different acts, and they would all play 1 or 2 tunes. So there were times when you walked on stage and you sang your current hit, and then you were off very quickly.
You had to dance after each artist had to do this. After you've been on and done your couple of songs, you had to go to the back of the stage and you know, do that with everybody else. It was really crazy.
Very good, Rob.
He's been practicing for years to do that.
Well done, Rob. Well done, Rob.
But also, Hugh had to drive a motorbike for the Shangri-Las. He had to drive a motorbike on stage, and I had the very onerous task when they sang "Give Him a Great Big Kiss." I had to go on and kiss Mary each time on stage.
Tell us that.
I didn't know that.
But it was so exhausting that there was a band on stage all the time with a full band. And sometimes one of the sax players would fall off his chair asleep.
And for you, Chris, and then you, what was it like visiting America for that first time for a bunch of kids from St. Albans in England?
Well, the weirdest thing is driving into New York City. We've only ever seen it on television and films. Then you hear sirens. We only had bells on our police cars. And then we heard, in Brooklyn, we sometimes heard shots at night, which we'd never heard in England. But it was a magic experience. It was like living in a TV programme.
It was absolutely amazing to go to America as young people. I mean, very few people travelled anyway. So to be given the pleasure and honour of going to New York and then playing there for the first time, and being successful, I have to say, was absolutely incredible.
And Colin, didn't your mother pack some fruit for you on the journey? Didn't your mother pack some fruit for you?
Oh, yes. My parents met us at the airport and she gave me a packed lunch for the plane. But the funny thing was that she also packed in an apple. I mean, there were thousands of fans around us, and my mother fought her way through. Here's your packed lunch for the plane. And she gave me an apple, and I hadn't eaten the apple on the plane, and you can't bring fruit into America. So the customs man, and there's thousands of people around us again, the customs man opened my bag, and he took my mother's apple out of my bag, and he ate it in front of me. I thought, I don't believe it, what's he doing? Then I realised that you couldn't bring apples, and that's how I learned that you can't do it.
But then, do you remember, then he said, what are you guys doing for Christmas? And we said, well, we haven't got anything planned. He said, well, come and have lunch at our place.
Yeah, exactly.
So we did.
We did. But before that, this is the same customs guy. Now remember, he had a gun. I've never seen a gun. And I was, I was trying to look at him, but I was all the time, I was looking down at this bloody gun. And he said, come, you, come with me. I thought, God, he's going to shoot me. Not only has he eaten my bloody apple, he's going to shoot me. So he took me into this little cubicle thing, and there was a phone there, and he phoned a number and he went, will you say hello to my family? So at least I wasn't shot on that occasion. I just had to say hello to his family, and then he invited us back, and we had either Christmas or New Year's Eve with his family. So it was a lovely ending. It's a frightening story.
I seem to remember he had a great daughter.
He did. I'm not saying anymore.
Did he serve apples or apple pie?
Well, I encouraged him to. I thought I'd try and get a little bit back. Yeah.
And that, be quite the experience, because now, today, of course, we have all this technology at our fingertips and everything, and you can plan for trips so differently. But I can imagine what that must have been like, just being thrust into that limelight, and as you said, screaming fans at the airport, all that stuff that was going on then. You?
Just to lead up to that, the answer to that question, in those days, of course, it was the birth of flying and aircraft travel. And my father was an aircraft engineer, and would never go on an aircraft, even though he built it himself. Part of building it. So I can't imagine what he must have thought about seeing his son going to America on an aircraft.
It was crazy. I know that we were trapped inside the Brooklyn fogs, really, for all day long. And one day, Paul decided to go out, and he got the shirt ripped off his back, and there were people coming at him with scissors, you know, to cut hair, just screaming everywhere. And the cops did save him, but they said that this is the last time we're going to do this. You're on your own if you do that. So it was a crazy time.
It was a crazy time, but in many ways for me it's exactly the same. I mean, we've got all this technology now, which I don't understand at all. And I didn't understand what was happening in 1964. It was a total mystery to me. And in many ways what happens in the music business is a mystery to me now. So I'm really lucky, nothing's changed. It's just a big mystery. And we have a wonderful tour manager who just walks just in front of us, and I just follow her. And that's how I get from one place to another. I don't know where we are, but she does.
Does she know where we are exactly right now?
Oh yes, she's right back there.
He's right there now.
She led me onto stage.
Big hand from Mariah.
She led me onto stage.
I want to touch upon something. In all the years I've been doing artist interviews and stuff, I never asked this question of the folks from your era. There was a time when concerts in the 60s and maybe into the early 70s, no, probably not, just the 60s though, where they were literally, you know, 20 minutes. I mean, when the Beatles played Shea Stadium, I think it was like 35, 40 minutes tops. I mean, could you imagine being one of those girls screaming your head off for 40 minutes, they leave and you go, that's it? That's what I screamed for? You know, when was that, what was that sea change like where all of a sudden, you know, it became an hour show or a 90-minute show or a 2-hour show, and what was, how did you guys prepare for that? I mean, physically, just, you know, having to sing and perform for that length of time as opposed to 20, 25 minutes.
Well, in our first incarnation, we actually split up in 1967. So it hardly got to the era when things were getting really extended. But at the same time, we were doing a lot of universities, weren't we, and colleges at the end of and there was a change coming. But I mean, that's why the Beatles split up. They said we could never, you know, Paul said we were losing our ability to become a good band on stage. Well, I don't believe that, because I still can't believe that in Shea Stadium, where I did Ringo's tour in 2006, and he told me that he couldn't hear a word of what was going on. He was just following the other guys' movements to see where he was. And yet, if you listen to that concert, they were all singing absolutely in tune. They still sounded great to me, and they were just coming through the PA in the sports stadium. You know, there was no real sound for them to judge what was going on. So even at that time, you know, they decided to become a studio band because it was just so hard. I mean, things are just so different now. You get a great sound when you're playing on stage. You can hear everything. That's what makes it such a joy now to play all the time. And we wouldn't do it, would we? Unless, I mean, when Col and I got back together again in the early 2000s to come over to America for the first time, we'd only decided to play 6 gigs for fun, but that's what gradually turned into 19 years of playing around the world. Because, thank you, but only because the tedium of touring never gets any easier, and it gets harder as you get older. But those 2 hours or hour and a half or whatever you get on stage are fantastic buzz, and it makes you feel completely rejuvenated. It's exactly the same feeling as when you're 18 years old, and you get the energy back from the audience. It's a real privilege to be able to do that, and you know, to play to guys like you and get all the energy back. That's why we're doing it, and without that, I don't think we would have come back on stage, would we?
No, absolutely not. It was a big surprise to us because, as Rod just said, we got together originally to play just 6 concerts. And we enjoyed it so much, it was just so incredible. I don't think we ever discussed whether we were going to go on doing more concerts. We just did it naturally. And the other thing we didn't realise was the huge interest there is in the Zombies repertoire all around the world. When we first got back together again, we hardly played any Zombie tunes. We played other things. And then people started saying, we want to hear more Zombie songs. And so the funny thing was, we had to relearn them.
We never played a lot of them live.
A lot
on
of them, we
stage,
played them in the studio and never played them live. So we had to learn these. It's a little bit embarrassing, really. Well, you know, how does this song go? I fucking remember this. I don't remember recording this song. And now we know most of them. You might spot some when we do a concert. You might spot some where I'm going, what? What's this? They're the ones I don't remember.
Actually, it was when we heard Tom Petty on a live show doing "I Want You Back Again" that I said to Colin, "We've never played that on stage, you know. Why don't we do it?" And that's when we started doing it.
That's right. Yeah.
What an absolute pleasure it was, and I would say for both Chris and I, when the idea of trying to play Odyssey and Oracle in its entirety came about, and we very first, thank you, which in brackets Chris and I love doing, I've got to say, but when we very first went round your house, Rod, on your invitation, and played round the piano, it was like we'd never been away. And those songs just fell into place like you wouldn't believe.
I have to say it was very embarrassing actually, wasn't it? Because Colin and I said, well, I don't know, you know, Chris hasn't really played for 40 years and, you know, we haven't played with Hugh for a long time. You know, we better have an acoustic rehearsal just to see what it sounds like. And it was so embarrassing because they were note perfect and Colin and I were all over the place.
It's funny, I phoned up Rod and said, do you realise it's 30 years since we released Odyssey and Oracle, and my son's at university, and he says, the kids really rate the album. He said, I think it might be popular. And Rod turned around to your wife and said, no, it's not. He said, and when we did the premiere, which was 30 years later, was it 30, 40? And it felt like we'd never stopped. Wow. It was weird, it was like being on stage with teenagers again. We still told the same old jokes, but forgot the ending. So.
And Chris, what was it like, you know, because you stepped away pretty early on, so what, you know, I mean, you'll be behind the scenes, but what was it like all of a sudden kind of being thrust once again back into that limelight, getting back on stage, dusting off the old bass, etc., etc.?
Practice. No, I've always been involved in music and producing. Rod and I produced Argent and co-wrote that all stuff. So I've been doing it ever since.
And also
I just
1 year.
thought Odyssey and Oracle, you know, it was just one of those things that didn't take off. And 50 years later, here it is. So I just had to practice again, you know. I had to buy a new bass.
So we talk about gigs of 30 minutes or so back in those days, and then moving into an hour or an hour and a half set. My joy was playing in local bands in England in what you might call the hiatus between early years and now, and the 3 hours was nothing. So I was match fit.
Yeah. 3 sets a night, couple of pints in between, you were ready to go.
Absolutely, you got it right.
Well, it's been quite a resurgence, and like you said, to think, you know, heck, you went your separate ways before the album even came out. And it wasn't, there was a bit of a sophomore slump, if you will, after the initial success of the first few singles, and then it kind of went down a little bit, and then you decided, okay, well, we did the first album and then the second album, but it came out, but you guys were pretty much split up by the end of the year, and then a year or two later, a buzz was generated about this album, and all of a sudden, you know, it became the legend that it is today.
Well, Chris and I were the songwriters, and we were getting very frustrated with the way our recent singles, if you like, before we did Odyssey and Oracle, were sounding. They weren't coming out the way we expected, you know, and the way we imagined the songs at all. So we were based in the UK, where we'd had smaller success than almost anywhere else in the world. And so our gig money was going down. Because we had a lot of success around the world, Chris and I were getting a good income. But the other guys who just relied on live playing, I remember Paul Atkinson saying, look, I'm getting married and I haven't got any money, I'm going to have to split up. I'm going to have to leave the band. But Chris and I managed to get a deal with CBS Records to produce a set of songs in the way that we wanted them to sound. And I think everybody in the band loved doing the album, and they were really, really happy with how everything turned out. For the first time in a long time, it was how we imagined those songs. And we were knocked out with the album, but of course the first single came out, it got some great reviews, the album, but it didn't actually sell anywhere. So we split up. And it was, as you say, 18 months later, when time of the season, there was one guy in Boise, Idaho, that actually played this single non-stop. And there he is, he's over there, I think. Yeah. And in the way that things could in those days, it was like a stone being thrown into a pond, and the ripples started to work their way outwards. And radio stations started to pick it up, and it started shooting up the charts. And as we said earlier, on March the 29th, 1969, it became a chart-topping record for us. So by that time, Chris and I had already formed a production company. We were planning Colin's first solo album. I'd formed Argent. And we got a deal with all those things, and we didn't want to go back on the road. It felt like retracing our steps to do that at the time, and we were very excited about the path that we were all on at that point. And that's when a lot of other bands actually filled the void, if you like, and started to say that they were the Zombies. And one of those bands admitted a couple of years ago they turned out to be ZZ Top. And two guys, Dusty and also Frank.
Dusty and Frank, right?
Yeah. So it was a crazy time, wasn't it? But Hugh, didn't you have a story about one of the fake Zombies?
Yes, I think he was one of the what is now ZZ Top, but it turns out that he'd changed his name by deed poll to mine, Hugh Grundy, and he'd taken up playing the bass, and was about 6 inches shorter than me, so I don't know how he thought he'd get away with it.
I mean, one of the other things was that we tried to stop these bands playing, and there was one in particular that was getting a lot of attention. They were getting attention because they weren't very good. And we were trying to stop them, and I'd written to the Musicians Union, and I'd written to a couple of other people, and eventually they stopped. They didn't play anymore. And I thought, oh, I don't know what I did, but something's worked here. And then we found out later that a disgruntled fan had gone into the dressing room and said to them, "You are not the Zombies." And then he pulled out a gun and threatened them. And I don't blame them, they never played again. So my letter to the Musicians Union, that may have been beautifully worded, I don't think it had the slightest thing to do with it. It was the gun that did it, every time.
It was the customs agent from 1964.
That's what I thought.
Was he eating an apple?
That's right. You're right, of course I hadn't thought of that.
But didn't one of the bands, Chris, or you jump in here, didn't one of the bands trademark the name?
Yes, they did.
I can tell you what that was. There was the Zombies Limited, was a company that we used. And then we gave up that name, the Zombies Limited, not the Zombies, the Zombies Limited. And a manager, God, I remembered his name, Brian Gannon is an English manager, and he bought the name the Zombies Limited, which is not quite the same as the Zombies, but that's what happened.
Oh, okay, because I didn't know if you were, mired in legal wranglings for years and stuff.
No, we've got the gun. We don't need that.
Yeah, it was when Rod and I were in America after Time of the Season was a hit and we were negotiating a deal. They said, could you phone up this promoter because they're promoting somebody called the Zombies? So we spoke to them on the phone and I said, they're not the Zombies. They said, he said, yes they are. He said, they've not got Colin Blonston, he got killed. I said, no, he's well alive. He said, yeah, no, that's not the story. We've got the real zombies. Colin, are you still alive?
Still alive. There's a little article on the front page of Rolling Stone that said, I was killed in a car crash, and this band was set up to honour...
He's a real zombie.
I used to have that cutting, and I've lost it. I really wish I still had it.
Yes. He's real, I promise you.
Are there photos of you walking barefoot across Abbey Road or anything? Well, here's my cheap attempt at a segue, but Abbey Road is where you did record the bulk of Odyssey and Oracle, if not all of it. Now, that's an album that Rolling Stone is, I believe, number 100 on the list of the 500 greatest albums of all time. It gets mentioned in the same breath as Days of Future Past, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, Pet Sounds. Those albums, they all came out either slightly before or right around the same time. Were they an influence on your decision to go in that kind of thematic direction, if you will?
Well, not consciously, and in fact we hadn't heard Sgt. Pepper because the Beatles were the previous band in to us, to Abbey Road, and as they were walking out, a week later we walked in to start recording Odyssey and Oracle. But I must say that, I don't know if everybody else agrees with this, but Pet Sounds have been out for a while, and I think we were all felt inspired, not to copy anything that was on there, but the way that Brian had sort of extended the vocabulary of what was possible in recording. And I know from a technical point of view, with my writing, I'd always loved to have melodic bass lines that sometimes didn't relate to the root of the chord. And that was something that Brian Wilson had always done. And when I heard Pet Sounds, he took it another stage further. And that certainly made me, on my songs on Odyssey and Oracle, want to explore that melodic nature of bass line in things like Care of Cell 44. Just about the first thing I wrote was that opening bass line phrase, etc., etc. So I think that just very, very indirectly, Pet Sounds had an influence on us by expanding that, vision of the way you could take things. I don't know if you agree with that, Chris, as the other...
Yeah, I do actually, and of course we only had £1,000 to do the whole album, and so we had to rehearse, so we rehearsed very thoroughly before we went in there. We just did them in different 3-hour sessions. We sometimes did 1 or 2 songs in the 3 hours, because we were well rehearsed, and we had the ability to Rod suddenly found there was a mellotron there, John Lennon had left, and so we added to it, and it was very exciting. But we did it for £1,000. That was incredible.
Well, also, I think Abbey Road at the time, even now it's a wonderful studio, but Abbey Road at the time was the place to be. And we were very lucky in that we had Geoff Emerick engineering and Peter Vince, they'd just been working on Sgt. Pepper. They were probably the best engineers in the world, and they really, really helped us. And as Chris just alluded, we were picking up percussion instruments off the floor that the Beatles had left just before us. So we were picking tambourines off the floor because they'd just been in there. And in the corner was John Lennon's mellotron, and we very naughtily just went over and used it. And if you listen to Odyssey and Oracle, there's mellotron all over it. And if John hadn't left his mellotron behind, it would have been a very different album. But we were just lucky to be in Abbey Road at that time. It was just, in the whole world, it was the place to be.
It was also very structured. It was a bit like a factory. You'd had 3-hour sessions, then it broke for lunch. People wore white or brown coats. So we were often very short for time. So on the album, we were doing a song called Changes, and it was just going over the hour. And while we were all round one microphone singing together, the crew came in and removed a piano while we were recording. We still had to use that recording because we didn't have enough time.
Incredible. And you, Geoff Emerick, as Rod mentioned, was the engineer on that. Now he was known for getting a certain drum sound for Ringo's kit and stuff like that. But did you guys did you want any relation to like some of the sounds that the Beatles created, or did you leave it up to him to get what he thought was best? How was it working with him?
I think as I recall, for a start, I was lucky enough to get a new drum kit when we won our first competition, and the only way I thought was it's going to be a Ludwig kit, because if it's good enough for Ringo, it's good enough for me. It turns out John Bonham as well.
But actually, I remember doing Time to See. Geoff Emerick only did the recording on 2 or 3 tracks on the album, but he did Time the Season, and I remember thinking at the time that he got a magical, the way the toms worked in with the bass line, it just sounded very special actually. And the funny thing was, we saw Geoff Emerick a week before he died. We did a concert in Los Angeles with Arcade Fire. And we talked to Geoff for about an hour afterwards, and at the end of it he said, don't forget, we've got to record again, and we've got to record again really, really soon. He said some lovely things about us in his book as well, and about recording with us, and that's what we really did intend to do. And a week later, you know, we got the phone call that he died just suddenly. But I think he wasn't. I think we felt that he did. I certainly felt he got an exceptional and an unusual sound on Time of the Season, and it was quite magical actually. And I know that George Martin reckoned that on Revolver that Geoff was really more responsible for the sound as a young guy, a really young guy there, than anybody else. And he was a sort of fledgling engineer at the time, but they just left it to him, and he would say, he would change what was on the board, and he'd say, you call that top? And he would just turn it 100% up. He'd turn the whole thing fully up. And he has some wonderful ears, I think.
No, I think one of the things with him, this is what he said to me, was that everyone who came into Abbey Road would say, can you get us the Beatles sound? Can you get us the Beatles sound? But we didn't do that. We went in and we just said, you know, just work your magic, just do what you think is appropriate for us. And I think he really liked that we weren't in search of the Beatles sound.
And it's funny, you mentioned Abbey Road, you mentioned Geoff, just a young apprentice and left to, you know, his own devices, if you will. And what a buddy of yours, Colin, you know, Alan Parsons, same thing. Well,
yes.
Yeah, Dark Side of the Moon. I mean, he's practically credited as the producer, even though technically he wasn't. But
well, Alan is a wonderful engineer and producer, and a lovely, lovely guy as well. And we all first met him. He was an assistant engineer at Abbey Road when we recorded Odyssey and Oracle. And I got to know him, and I realised that he lived just up the road from me. And so we used to meet some Saturday mornings in the Flask in Hampstead Village, and we would drink a couple of pints of Young's beer. I do recommend it. And then he first started talking about the idea of being a producer, this producer being a central figure in recording an album. And he always said to me, would you like to do it if I got this together? And I couldn't do the first one because I was living actually in California and they were recording in London. But I did the second one, and I did about 5 after that. So from Pyramid, where I did the Eagle Will Rise Again on Pyramid, and then from there onwards, you know, and I did Old and Wise on Eye in the Sky, and many others with that one. And he is another wonderful, wonderful engineer. But of course, he's known now as a producer. But he was an engineer when we first met him.
I had mentioned about, you know, whether or not some of those albums influence Odyssey and Oracle. I want to go back further. I want to kind of talk to you guys about some of your musical influences. And Rod, I'm going to end with you because it's something that you said that started this whole conversation this morning. So, Chris, for you, growing up there in England, what was it? Was there music in the household as a kid? What inspired you to want to become a musician?
My father played double bass and semi-professional, But then, first thing I remember hearing is Rock Around the Clock, and that was a big change. And then Elvis Presley, Hound Dog, that really moved. He suddenly got excited what music could do. I think Rod had the same thing as well.
My father, for his blessings, played the violin, and he was very keen for me to learn to play the violin. But I was listening to the underground radio stations, and I was hearing rock and roll for the first time, and I thought, violin, maybe not. So, but drums came into my life, and here we are.
Was it rock and roll drummers though, or was it like, you know, some jazz guys like Cozy Cole and stuff like that?
Yes, it was to a certain extent. Maybe 75% rock and roll drummers and 25% jazz drummers. So I was influenced by all of them and trying to do all the various things they did. So I was listening to every one and picking a little bit from him and him and him and making it my own.
Colin?
Well, I remember when I was really young that on my mother's side she had 5 brothers and they all played 2 or 3 different instruments. So I probably was influenced when I was really young, you know, before I was 10 or something like that, by them. And then I managed to talk my parents into buying me a guitar when I was about 10 or 11 years old, because I loved rock and roll, and I started to explore playing the guitar when I was about 10 or 11 years old. And I joined the band as a guitarist. I was never the singer. Rod was the singer for a short while. Actually, Rod was the singer for about half an hour. And I was the guitarist for about half an hour, and I got eased out because I'm absolutely hopeless. And I could feel these burning eyeballs going into the back of my head every time I made a mistake, which was just about every song. So I started off as a guitarist, but then I either got promoted or demoted, I'm not quite sure. And then I became the lead singer.
And then, Rod, the reason why I wanted to end that line of questioning with you was because it goes back to the top of our conversation, and there was a statement you released when you found out that the Zombies were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And I'll just start it out for you. It started in 1956, and it started with your cousin, the late, great Zombies, King Spaces, and Argent bassist, Jim Rodford. And if you'd kindly pick up the story from there.
Well, Jim, you're absolutely right. Jim was my cousin. He was 4 years older than me. And when I was 11 years old, I used to constantly go down to his place, which was maybe 250 yards away from where we lived. And I was in love with music, but it was mainly, the only music I'd really heard around that time was some very sort of anodyne popular music of the time. People, you know, I don't know, like Perry Como and, you know, Rosemary Clooney and things like that. And I wasn't really particularly knocked out with that. My mother used to love the sort of lollipops, the very well-known pieces of classical music, which is what I heard. But anyway, I still loved some of those, but I was down at Jim's house one day and he was playing some Bill Haley. And I thought, yeah, it's okay, you know, I sort of half got into it. But then he said, well, let me play you this. And he changed my world in 3 minutes. And he played me Elvis singing Hound Dog. And that, I've always felt, for me, that was my introduction to black music by proxy. Because at the time, that was the only sort of rhythm and blues inspired stuff that I ever heard. And it was that made me want to search out the rawest rock and roll I could find. People like, obviously, Little Richard. It was a great time for rock and roll around that time. Little Richard, and all the other great people who were playing. And very soon discover people like Big Mama Thornton, who did the original version of Hound Dog. And then very soon after that, Ray Charles sort of moved me into that whole thing. But also, Jim was in one of the earliest electric bands in the whole of the south of England. And I went along to see them at the age of 11, Jim was 15. I was completely blown away. And I thought, I have to form a band as soon as I possibly can. And still all around that time, I was still, it was a great time for music. I was discovering the Miles Davis group of around 1958, which was absolutely fantastic. And like many other English musicians, I was finding and discovering the urban blues people like Chuck Berry, etc., and the older blues people, you know, like Muddy Waters, etc. So it was really an incredibly exciting time. But Jim was really my mentor for a lot of my life. He was the first person to hear She's Not There when it was first recorded. He loaned us all the gear for our very first rehearsal. And at the time, with all the Blue Tones gear, we thought we sounded pretty hot. But later, in fact, just a couple of years ago, he confided to Colin that he thought, no chance, when he first heard us. But, you know, that continued. I formed Argent with him, I was a founder member, and then, of course, as many of you know, he was on he was the bassist on the biggest selling Kinks album, I think, in America, and the #1 single of Come Dancing. And it's, you know, a real tragic loss to me as from a personal point of view, and from the point of view that he's always been there throughout our whole career. And of course, he was the first person I went to when Colin and I got back together again about 19 or 20 years ago now. And he suddenly went. It was after playing in Florida. He went. He had a slight virus, a cold virus. He went home and he was really jet lagged, and his wife, Jean, who a lot of you know, because a lot of you have met Jean on these cruises, she went to bed. Jim came up maybe 3-4 hours later, tripped on the stairs, fell backwards, and as far as we can work out, hit his head on a vulnerable point, and that caused heart failure, and he was gone. Just like that. And it's very, very sad, but that was definitely the moment that turned me on to rock and roll.
And he'll no doubt be with you, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in spirit as well.
Absolutely. Wow. I know the other day we got a message saying that this year's Grammys, they put up a big in memoriam photograph of Jim. So that was really cool.
Chris and you, back down to the two of you. When did you know that the Zombies were onto something, that this was going to be more than just a bunch of school kids knocking around, that, you know, we're not bad?
Well, it was when our first recording session, when we won a contest. He said, well, will you write something? Rod wrote She's Not There, and I wrote another track. And Colin nearly finished them because the engineer we were recording with was drunk. He'd been at a wedding all afternoon, and he was very insulting, and he passed out. We had to carry him out of the studio. Colin said, I thought, oh, don't want to be recording anymore. But the assistant engineer was Gus Dudgeon, so he was the one who did She's Not There. But I forgot what the question was.
I think in our beautiful young naivety, we were just absolutely thrilled to be doing what we were doing at the time. And when we started listening back to what we'd been recording, in our wonderful naivety, we just thought it was going to be huge and massive.
I think for me, the first time I just dared to think there might be a future for us, we went into a big rock and roll competition. I've got to be honest, I felt self-conscious that we were even going into a competition. I thought, you know, nothing's going to happen. But it was 10 bands a night for 10 weeks, so there was 100 bands. And blow me down, we won it. We won it. And I just thought, maybe there's a chance for us. You know, you just start to dream at that point. And winning that competition led to us going to our first recording session. And in that session, as the guys just said, we recorded She's Not There, and we were off and running. So in a very short period of time, we went from being a school band to an international hit band who were traveling all around the world. It's a little confusing, but it's great fun.
And you, have you missed it these last, I mean, I know you came back 15 for a couple shows and then 17, but before that, or, you know, now living in Spain is really what it's all cracked up to be, so you can give a rat's ass about touring.
very interesting. Yes, as I think I said earlier, in the gap between our first incarnation and where we are now, I've always continued to play. I worked for CBS Records for a while, and I played on quite a few of the records that came out as a session drummer. And in the last 10 years, I have been living in Spain, and I have some wonderful friends out there, and I have a band out there. They're called the Geckos. 3 cheers for the Geckos. Thank you. And I've been playing with them and having the most fun that I've ever had in my life. Little thinking when I moved there that I was going to be playing again. And how funny it is that playing with them has returned my love of the drums. And so I was really ready when the guys decided to redo Odyssey and Oracle, so I was really up for it.
And Chris, you stayed active, but as you mentioned earlier, behind the scenes, content with that, or have you ever missed the road and been...
Hey, it's been great. We still like each other, and when we do Odyssey and Oracle, we do it exactly as we recorded it from beginning to end. That's fun. But then Colin and Rod going on doing new things is having the new stuff as well as looking back at the old stuff, which is the pleasure, it really is.
And that does bring us full circle. I know there's been some new music in the works. What can you guys tell us about that?
Well, we had, as a lot of people know, we had an album out in late 2015, and we were completely knocked out because Billboard took the trouble to phone us while we were on tour and say that it was in the top 100 album sales charts, which was just felt fantastic to us. Thank you. And that's very important to us, because without that feeling of being able to still create and the excitement of putting things together in the way we always have done, that's why we were in the business in the first place. And without that, I don't think Colin and I would be still playing. And we've just started to think about a new album now. I know I've got a couple of ideas for new songs, and we're just starting to play them over in soundcheck, etc., etc. So I hope sometime this year we're going to be starting on a new album as well.
Yeah, Colin, what's your thoughts about that? I guess it's. I understand certainly having new music. It's what you do. It drives me nuts when people they go, "Who have you interviewed lately?" And I mention someone. They're still around. Yeah, they're still around. I mean, I know everybody's life has gotten busy, and you kind of lose track of who's on the road, who's recording. But this is what you guys do.
It's my brother-in-law is Paul McCartney's recording engineer, and he told me the story about the interview that Paul was having, and I think it was an Irish lady who was interviewing, and she said, no, it wasn't, it was an Israeli lady, I think, but said, why are you still doing this? She said, you've got more money than I could possibly imagine. She said, you don't have to do this anymore. And he said, I beg your pardon. And she said, well, you don't have to do it. He said, it's what I do. What else am I going to do? And I still wake up in the morning and think, my God, well, firstly, what a strange way of making a living, sort of creating music that, you can have a melody that bores people to tears. You can change one note and it can move people to tears. It's a very odd way to earn your living, really, to do that. But to wake up each morning and think, I'm one of the small percentage of people who's managed to earn a living all my life by doing what I would otherwise get up paid to do. And that's the answer to that question, really. That's why it's so important.
Well, also, I think for all of us, the big thrill is to be involved in the beginning of a new song, to see the spark of an idea of a new song, and then you see it develop through rehearsals and in the studio, and then you get the pleasure of taking that song out and playing it live. It's such a thrill, that whole journey of seeing a song develop out of thin air, and then you go out and you play live, and that's what energizes us. That's what makes us want to keep playing. And I think that if we took the element of new music out of it, I think the Zombies would sort of peter away over a period of time. That's the thrill, is to be playing new music. We love to play the old classics too, but it's the new music that keeps us energized.
Well, as Dave Mason said, there are no old songs, only good songs. So But the second part of that question is, so I get it completely, pushing the envelope, trying to still perhaps come up with the perfect song, the quintessential song, if you will, because no artist is ever satisfied with anything they've ever done. Let's face it, that's usually the thread that is common amongst all of you. But then when it comes to now albums and stuff, in today's day and age, it's very different, and a lot of artists will say it's not worth the time and effort. I mean, we make the money we make is from touring. It's not going to be from album sales and stuff. So that's where do you sit on the fence in terms of that, and how do you kind of wrap your heads around that dilemma?
There are still billionaires in the business, but they all own streaming companies now, unfortunately. And I think it's a real shame that so many musicians have been deprived of a lot of their livelihood. I mean, I stream stuff. It's out there all the time, and it's just a very easy thing to do. If you hear someone's got a new album out, you just have to switch on and stream it, you know. But you can see from your royalty statements that something might be played 100,000 times, and you get pennies out of it. And I think it's a real shame because it stops the process of invention to some degree, because musicians just can't afford to.
We can't afford to lose new young musicians. It's a very important medium. Music affects people, moves people, and we can't afford to lose it. So young groups don't get the opportunity to do this. That's the change at the moment.
Yeah, it's very important to certainly, keep creating and trying to become your own person, if you will. Is there some new music today that's really piquing your interest? Do you guys seek out new music by younger bands, younger artists? Chris, I'll start with you.
You shouldn't start with me because my sons keep trying to introduce me, and some of them, the Lemon Twigs was a very interesting one because they're inventive, and then I keep being introduced to younger, but I'm getting to the age where I can't remember their names, Can't even remember my son's name, so.
And you, what about yourself? New music, anything catches your ear, or you just...
Interesting question. Not an awful lot, I've got to say, but I'm well aware that, of course, it's just as important music today as it was then. So I listen to it, yes, but don't know.
You can't remember either.
I can't remember either.
I think that often the music that's most important to you is the music you listen to in your formative years. So between sort of 14 and 24, that music stays with you for life, and it's certainly true with me. The only new music I hear is when my daughter's at home with us and she's playing music very loud, and instead of saying, turn the music down, I'm always shouting out the stairs, what's that? Who's that person you're playing? That's when I get to know about who the new artists are. But there's a singer-songwriter I'm listening to at the moment, a lady singer-songwriter in the UK called Judy Zook. I do recommend her to you. She writes the most wonderful songs, and she's got a really beautiful voice. So Judy Zook's well worth listening out for.
Rod, for you?
Well, I do echo what Colin was saying, and I think it's an age thing to some degree. I still find myself listening to things that turned me on over an earlier part of my life. I mean, I still listen to early Ray Charles things, particularly as the early times. Oh God, I don't know really. I mean, I still love the music that I heard then. Occasionally, I think it's an age thing. When you're 18 years old, you go out to parties and you hear everything that's there without even thinking about it. And there's a grapevine that goes on, and you hear things that pique your interest, and that you really like.
I just want to interrupt Rob for a minute about going to parties. And there was a party we went to when we were about 19 or 20.
Yeah.
And we played A Whiter Shade of Pale. And I just thought I'd mention that because Propo Band are on the ship. We played Whiter Shade of Pale all night.
But it wasn't us, it was the poets, I think.
Yeah. So
there was one record on all night long, and that was Whiter Shade of Pale.
9 o'clock till 9 o'clock in the morning. We just played that one record.
I know, that was crazy. But, I mean, I do echo what Chris said. When I do hear something, and it's often the young band that's that wants to meet us. And the Lemon Twigs were very kind about, you know, loving our music, etc. So I listened to them, and I absolutely loved their first album in particular. And there's a song called I Want to Prove to You. There's another song on that album called These Days, which I thought had complete originality, influences from the most unexpected places, but soulful as well. And I did like that, particularly that first album, very much indeed. But I mean, I'm sure there's some great music out there, but I probably just haven't heard the new stuff.
Well, it is amazing that, you know, we're sitting here 50 some odd years later, and your music still gets played. There's not a day that goes by that you don't hear one of the songs on the radio. These people wouldn't be here if they didn't enjoy what it is that you put forward and the show that you did, if you would. Finally, as I mentioned, this is the 5th cruise I've done, and this is the 4th one for you guys, I think. Every year, there's been a conflict, and I could never get to your show, whether I'm hosting another Q&A, whatever. Well, I went last night, and I had to leave like 20 minutes in because I had to go MC Alan Parsons. Turned out they were running behind. They said, no, we're just going to go on. I said, oh, good. Got right back up and sat for the rest of your show, and I was just blown away. And I guess you could say sometimes I've become a bit of a jaded journalist. I live in New York City, so you get a chance to see everybody and their mother comes through town. But I just left with the biggest smile on my face last night. It was just such a fun show. The playing was excellent. The sound was great. Thank you. It was a lot of fun. Thank you very much. And as we wrap up here now, just a couple of housekeeping things. You're going to be leaving this ship and back out on the road. Where can we see you? You got some. You're pretty busy. And Colin, you're doing double duty because you're also doing some solo band shows as well.
Yeah, I've just done a solo tour across the northeast of the States, and it was freezing. So it's nice to be out in the sun. Yeah, we're going to be playing tonight, so please come along if you get a chance to see us tonight. And then later I'm going to play with my solo band, which will be fun. And it's totally different songs. It's not going to be a Zombies thing, it's a totally different thing. And then Rod and I take the Zombies on a tour across the south of the States after the cruise. We're going through Florida, across to Texas. So if you get the chance to come and see us, please do come.
Busy days ahead for everybody.
Yes.
But
no peace for the wicked.
But the biggest date of all in the foreseeable future is March 29th at the Barclays Center in Brooklyn, New York. And I'll just leave you with this. Not only is this a great thrill for all of you, but I asked you about your influences, and the best part is now is that the names Rod Argent, Colin Blunstone, Hugh Grundy, and Chris White are going to be right up there with Elvis Presley, Howlin' Wolf, Muddy Waters, the Beatles, the Moody Blues, the list goes on and on. Congratulations, it's long overdue. The Zombies 2019 Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductees. Thank you very much.